Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Thanks for being here with us. I'm Katie Earle. I'm the coordinator of our University Express program, and we're joined here with Rosanne Higgins. Welcome, Rosanne.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you. All right, quick housekeeping for our new folks that are on today. We're recording this session, and I'll try to post it on our website in the near future. You're joined muted and without your video showing, and it's not because you've done anything wrong, it's just the settings for our program today. So we'll be communicating with you through our Q&A panel. I have the chat open for a second, but I'm going to deactivate that. So we'll use the Q&A. So if you're on a computer, look at the lower right-hand side of your screen. You can click on that, expand the panel. You'll see the text box. Send your questions to me. And then same if you're on a tablet or smartphone, touch your screen. That brings up your control panel. You'll see a circle with 3 dots. There you'll find your Q&A. So same thing, text box, send your questions right to me. Awesome. So we'll quickly thank our sponsors, which is our Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And Senior Services is here for you if you need any questions or if you need any help or have any questions. We're at 858-8526. Now the star of our show, Rosanne Higgins, PhD, is an anthropologist, a lecturer, and a writer. She received a master's degree and doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Buffalo. Her primary areas of study were skeletal biology and historical demography. These two fields of inquiry have been employed to the study of the disenfranchised in the United States during the 19th century. She was an assistant professor in the anthropology department at SUNY Potsdam and an assistant professor in the health sciences department at Cleveland State University. She's a small business owner and an adjunct professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Buffalo. Her goal has been to share her research for both the scholarly community and the public at large. And she's here with us this morning. Rosanne, thank you. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Somebody just knocked on my door, so give me 1 second.
That's
okay. Sorry about that. Of course, right the minute I used to have a cat that interrupted me, but now it apparently is humans. Anyway, thank you all. I can't see you, but I appreciate you tuning in, and to you, Katie, for welcoming me back to University Express. I have to say I've really missed the in-person lectures, and I'm excited for the fall when we go back to that. So I think probably a lot of you know that most of what I talk about here at University Express are my historical fiction book series, the Orphans and Inmates series, which had primarily dealt with Buffalo's institutional past, which was my primary area of scholarly research. But as the series progressed, it seemed like there were other aspects. I don't know, can you all see this? Because Katie, your image is in the middle of my thing, but everybody can read the quote.
Yep, and you can move my head over, and
okay, I don't need to move you as long as everybody else can. Okay. Anyway, this quote, which was from an unknown author in 1869, really sums up why Buffalo is such an interesting place and why other aspects of Buffalo's history really have found their place in my book. And it's also become apparent to me that the institutions, the insane asylum and the poorhouse, didn't operate in isolation of what was going on in the city of Buffalo and in the area of Western New York in general. There's this whole really interesting history that is interwoven in and around the institutions in the city itself. And the more I research and write these books, the more other areas of Buffalo's history become apparent and interesting to me. So one of the things that had fascinated me in terms of its impact on the institution's history were the infectious disease epidemics that plagued Buffalo and other major cities during the 19th century. And my third book, The Seer and the Scholar, which took place in the 1840s, primarily dealt with the cholera epidemics. And as I was sort of researching Buffalo in that area, it became apparent to me that the advent of modern spiritualism and the Lilydale community, particularly, which is about an hour south of us, that's when that whole movement really started to take hold. And that really piqued my interest and started to find its way into the books and really has become part of the ongoing story, not only of Buffalo, but of my characters in particular. And so to give you a little bit of background, There was a man named Franz Mesmer, and he was an Australian healer, and he was an 18th century healer. And he had this idea that the universe and included in the universe, human bodies were all governed by this magnetic fluid. And that when that fluid became imbalanced, that's when people started to experience poor health. And Mesmer, through a process that he called mesmerization, or what we now know of as hypnosis, Mesmer claimed to be able to manipulate that magnetic force, excuse me, and restore balance to the force, and then ultimately restore balance to health. And that idea, which again started in the 18th century in Australia, kind of wound its way into the United States, and people became interested in it in the early decades of the 19th century. And so also getting back to that sort of quote about New York being this hotbed for unusual and unorthodox ways of thinking, Leona, New York, which you can see on the red star on this map, became this sort of stopping point for what they called itinerant speakers. And those were anybody who had something interesting and particularly unorthodox to say. So people who spoke about politics, abolitionism, people who talked about women's rights and suffrage, and people who talked about alternate sources of healing. Those were kind of the sorts of people who made their way around the country talking to anybody who would listen. And Leona had this general store that happened to be the gathering place for those sorts of people. And so there was a man in 1844 identified in the Lilydale historical record only as Dr. Morin, who found his way to Leona, and he claimed to be a mesmerist. And so he spent a few days in Leona talking at the general store and demonstrating his ability to mesmerize or hypnotize people. And so there was a man there by the name of William Johnson, excuse me, who was the son of a minister, but he was very interested in mesmerism, and he sort of was interested in learning the process, and so he became a mesmerist. And there was another man who lived in the area by the name of Jeremiah Carter, and Jeremiah Carter was not available on the days that Dr. Morin was there. He was taking care of his son, or his grandson, excuse me, who was sick. And so he had been very interested and wanted to hear about the mesmerism because of its healing potential, because Jeremiah Carter also happened to be suffering from tuberculosis. So in the end, it was William Johnson who mesmerized Jeremiah Carter. And in those states of hypnosis, not only was he able to do healing, but he was able to sort of know things that he didn't know in his conscious mind. And eventually Jeremiah Carter was able to place himself in that state, in that what they would call a trance, without the aid of a mesmerist. And so that became something that people in Chautauqua County were interested in, and so people from all over the county started to gather in this general store to sort of witness this process of mesmerization and all the interesting things that it claimed to be able to do. And it was out of that movement, out of that group of people, that the Religious Society of Free Thinkers was formed. And they were still sort of centrally located in Leona, and they hosted speakers like Elizabeth Lowe Watson, who I'll talk about a little bit later, and also a man named Andrew Jackson Davies, who is really credited with sort of combining the idea of mesmerism with the ideas of a Swedish philosopher named Emanuel Swedenborg. He believed that the afterlife was characterized by various levels of heaven and various levels of hell. And your degree of selfishness would result on the depths that you might descend into hell, and your degree of selflessness would impact your ability to ascend into the higher levels of heaven. And he also believed that people were able to speak to spirits on the other side. So you have this idea of mesmerism, this idea that going into this hypnotic state gave you access to energy and to information that you didn't have in your conscious mind. And then you have the Swedenborg ideas of being able to talk to people on the other side. And Andrew Jackson Davis actually merged these ideas into what really was the foundation of modern spiritualism. And still in this area of New York, in the area around what is now Cassadaga, which Leona is only a couple of miles from, they started to have these sort of picnics every year where free thinkers would gather because the country store just wasn't big enough anymore. This was attracting hundreds, sometimes even thousands of people, these ideas. And it wasn't just the ideas of mesmerism, and spiritualism, but it was also, again, politics. It was a political equality and abolitionism and temperance and all of these other ideas that were sort of considered, radical and not what the normal conventions of 19th century life. And so, as I said, the Religious Society of Freethinkers started to hold these picnics in the area of Cassadaga in the summers, and they would gather, again, larger groups of people. And there was a man named Willard Alden who was a member of this group, and he had a farm not far outside of Leona near Cassadaga Lake, and he had offered his farm for these spiritualist picnics. And every year they sort of started lasting longer, and they became these, sessions where people would come and stay for days, and they would attract large numbers of speakers. And they sort of turned into these camp sessions where people were actually staying in the location for, a couple of weeks at a time. And again, talking about all of these radical ideas. And so the camp sessions, got larger and larger. And once Willard died, the land was continuing to be used by the free thinkers, but Willard's heirs were realizing that, the spiritualists were starting to actually make money off of these because they would charge an admission fee. And again, they were attracting thousands of people. And so Alden's heirs decided that they wanted essentially a cut of the gate. They wanted money to continue to allow their land to be used as part of this, camp meeting sort of thing. And so the freethinkers they weren't happy about this, and so they ended up ultimately purchasing land by Cassadaga Lake. They reformed into the Cassadaga Lake Free Society in 1879. Their camp sessions got larger and larger, and a local, permanently living community started to develop in that area. In 1903, I believe the society changed its name again to the City of Light, or the City of Light Assembly. And some people think it's because they had electricity in one of the earlier, groups to have villages to have electricity. Other people thought that City of Light meant the enlightenment of being a free thinker. I think it's more inclined to be the latter than the former. It changed its name again in 1906 to various incarnations of Lilydale, or the Lilydale Assembly, which it continues to be today. And the Lilydale Assembly is a religious community of spiritualists. So modern spiritualism is a religion. And among its, tenets is that there is this ability to speak to people, who have passed to the spirit side, and that, your death is not the end of spiritual life. And what's interesting to me as an anthropologist about modern spiritualism is that it does not require you only to be a spiritualist. There are a lot of people who practice other religions who are also considered modern spiritualists, so it doesn't ask you to be exclusive. It's an interesting, again, for me as an anthropologist, it's very interesting to me because it represents, a place for women in Victorian society where they had rights and privileges that other Victorian women did not have. They were allowed to express their opinions. They were allowed to take part in the running of this village and of this religion. They had positions of power. Women were respected as healers in the spiritualist community where they were not, in the emerging modern medical community. So there were all kinds of reasons I was interested in modern spiritualism, not only just the historical impact it had on the Western New York area, but also just for me, all of the interesting things about it from a biocultural perspective. So the Fox sisters were a group of sisters that really were thought to be the founders of modern spiritualism. And so they are the first of a group of women that I want to tell you about who had a profound impact on modern spiritualism and who also influenced characters in my books. As I started to read about modern spiritualism, the role of women actually fascinated me, again, because it was so different from what traditional Victorian women were like. And so the Fox sisters have a very, very interesting story. They actually make their appearance in The Seer and the Scholar, which is my third book, as themselves, because they were starting to travel around the country, claiming to be able to make contact with people from the spirit world. So let me just back up and tell you how all of that happened. And again, this was in New York, in Hydesville, New York. The Fox family rented, excuse me, a cottage for a short period of time while their home was under construction. And prior to them moving into that cottage, there had been a rumor that a peddler who was like a traveling salesman had wandered by the farm. He had been murdered by the man who owned the farm. Allegedly, his bones had been, buried in their basement. And the original family who owned the cottage, got out of there, obviously, before they were found out. The cottage was then occupied by another man. After that, he was bothered by strange noises and he left. So in come in 1848, the Fox family. The two younger daughters were Katie and Maggie. They were like 10 and 14 at the time. They had an older sister who lived in Rochester. Her name was Leah. So Katie and Maggie claimed to be hearing these rapping noises in their bedroom around bedtime every night, this sort of kind of noise. And this was allegedly the same noise that had frightened the previous tenant away. So they started to talk to another neighbor because they were becoming more concerned about this noise. And they would sort of, is somebody there? If you're there, knock once, and the knock would happen. And then, so they would find interesting ways to communicate with this noise that they took to be somebody from the spirit world. And they learned that he had been, in fact, murdered, by the previous owners. So all of a sudden this cottage becomes, a source of local interest, and, lots of people are flocking to this cottage at all hours of the day or night, trying to understand and be witness to this, extraordinary ability of these two young girls to communicate with the spirit world. And so it becomes sort of too much for the family, and they move on and they leave the cottage. But the older sister sort of sees this as an opportunity, and she takes the two daughters, the younger sisters, with her to Rochester, and where they perform for a number of people, first in private, among them actually Andrew Jackson Davies, and others, and then they end up performing in these big auditoriums and claiming to be able to still maintain contact with the spirit world. And again, it's all about hearing these rapping noises and being able to speak and ask the rapping noise to essentially perform parlor tricks. And it really takes off, and they end up traveling all over the country doing this thing. And it becomes, you need to sort of up the ante every time, so that the audience now is expecting, more than just a couple of rapping noises. And so the performance becomes more elaborate. There's this debate all over the country. Are they legitimate? Are they not? Attempts to expose them are always foiled. Nobody's ever actually able to expose fraud, if there is any. And so the girls, Kate and Maggie, as they grow older, they continue to do that work, not only publicly, but privately as mediums as well. And the pressure really and Leah also claims to be a medium. So she continues to stay in Rochester while the two girls tour the country. But the pressure to keep outdoing themselves really gets too much. And the two sisters, as they get older, they sort of take to alcohol to manage that pressure, and they both become alcoholics. And Katie actually marries a little bit younger. I think she married in the 1850s, late 1850s, and her husband asked that she leave mediumship. He tried to expose her as a fraud as well and was unable to, but he sort of talks her into leaving once she's married. And so she ends up leaving, although she does actually go back to Lilydale and to what was then the Cassadaga Lake Free Society, and she speaks in 1882, but by then she had left sort of the field as a practicing medium because it was really difficult to make a living at it at the time. And eventually she admits that there's fraud, like in 1888 or somewhere thereabouts. She admits that they originally, started the whole trick as a prank on their mother, and it just grew out of control. And then there was all this debate in the community among mediums, because mediums, the whole spiritualist community really credited the Fox sisters with founding their religion. So of course it came as a huge blow when this woman came out and said, no, it's not true. And so their argument, the people who still thought her to be legitimate, was that by then she was, her husband had passed, she was destitute, she was offered a lot of money to do that interview and to admit it to be a fraud. And she was also very angry at her older sister, Leah, who had exploited them and wanted to expose Leah because Leah had always been a fraud. And she wanted to expose Leah as a fraud, and she was paid substantially for that interview. And so the people who supported her in modern spiritualism argued that she said those things because she was destitute and desperate. And in fact, some years later, she did recant that confession. So whether or not, she was entirely a fraud or only partially a fraud, is still up for debate within the modern spiritualist community. But a lot of people today still credit the Fox sisters as being legitimate and having, really founded their religion. And so interestingly enough, Maggie becomes an alcoholic. They both actually died paupers. I think at one point Maggie's children, or Katie's children, one of them, were taken away from them. And so they really kind of died in disgrace and impoverished. And strangely enough, in 1904, there were bones found in the Hydesville cottage, in the basement. And so I think that sort of breathed new life into the idea that the Fox sisters were in fact legitimate. But then there were other people who examined the bones and found them to be like just a couple of human bones and some chicken bones, and not really enough to say it was a skeleton that had been buried there. And so there's all this, depending on what you're inclined to believe, you can decide it was entirely a hoax, or you can decide that parts of the Fox sisters' abilities were real, and they only resorted to fraud when they were pressured to continuously come up with this spectacular kind of entertainment all of the time. It sort of depends on, your own personal beliefs in the ideas of spiritualism anyway. And I've talked to most of the people I've spoken to in Lilydale believe the sisters were legitimate in their abilities to speak to spirit, but that they were exploited and pressured and, ultimately resorted to fraud, but did believe that their initial abilities were real. So you can take that for what it is, but they are credited, again, as sort of the founders of this religion, and were credited among the first people who really were legitimately able to speak to somebody on the other side. And as I said, you can read sort of more about them in, read the facts about them in just about any historical source on modern spiritualism. But as I said, I did weave their story into my book, The Seer and the Scholar, which is, again, that time period starts out as modern spiritualism was just getting its legs. Another woman who was incredibly influential, particularly in the founding of the Lilydale community, was a woman named Marion Skidmore. Now, she was the daughter of William Johnson, and you'll recall that William Johnson was one of our early mesmerists. And so she was sort of born into, this religion. And she grew up in Leona, but she really became focused on spiritualism after the death of her daughter. And she lost her daughter, she lost her daughter as an adult. So it was a very profound loss to her. And there are a lot of people who have studied modern spiritualism who credit, its emergence with just sort of the social circumstances of the 19th century. During the 19th century, particularly after the Civil War, but during the century in general, mortality was very high, particularly for women Childbirth, could be fatal often for women. The average age of death for women in the 19th century was like mid-30s. And the average infant mortality was, of course, incredibly high as well. Through most of the century, half the babies born died before their first year. So there was a lot of grief over the loss of loved ones in the 19th century. And for, working class or poor women, that grief often had to be put aside because the stress and the needs of just daily survival, filled up their every day. And so they couldn't really be consumed with grief because they had to get up every day and raise their children and oftentimes support their household and maintain their households and all of that. But for wealthier women who had a lot of free time and leisurely time, the argument is that deaths had a profound impact, more so because they had more time to dwell on it. And so modern spiritualism became a religion that attracted wealthier women because that ability to be able to speak to loved ones on the other side was attractive, obviously, to people who had, sustained profound losses. And so Marion Skidmore was one of those women. She wasn't so much wealthy in her younger days. She did marry quite well, but she did feel that profound loss, and she became focused on spiritualism and the idea of speaking to the dead after the loss of her daughter. She also married Thomas Skidmore, who was one of the founding members of the Cassadaga Lake Free Society. And so they, as a couple, really were very instrumental in the community's founding. And in fact, Susan B. Anthony, at Marion Skidmore's death, Susan B. Anthony spoke of Marion Skidmore as the sort of the light and life of Lilydale. She had her hand in every aspect of its founding. And her most profound, I think, contribution was the library. It started as a tent sort of in the middle of the camp where she would collect books on modern spiritualism. And then eventually it became a brick and mortar building that still stands today and is named, in fact, the Marion Skidmore Library after her. And so in addition to her sort of contributions to the Lilydale community in general, she was a big believer in women's rights. And as I said, she enjoyed a very equitable relationship with her husband, which most, Victorian women didn't. Society women were supposed to keep their opinions to themselves. They were not supposed to be overly educated. They were supposed to be involved in charitable works and in artistic pursuits, but not anything of substance. And Marion Skidmore had opinions. She had opinions about politics and about women's suffrage particularly. And so she was the president of the Cassadaga Women's Suffrage Club. And she was an officer in the Political Equality Club. She represented Cassadaga in the 1894 National Women's Suffrage Association. So she was a very active woman in women's suffrage. And the Lilydale community in general was very active in women's suffrage. They used to hold, as part of their camp sessions later on in the 19th century and into the 20th century, they would hold these women's days or women's equality days where speakers would come from all over the country to speak on women's suffrage and other aspects of political equality as well. And Susan B. Anthony was a frequent visitor to Lilydale, although she was not considered a spiritualist. She was a frequent supporter of the community because of its support of women's suffrage. And in fact, there's a really funny Susan B. Anthony story. She did have a reading one time with a medium, and I think her great aunt came through. And she was very pragmatic. She said, I didn't like this woman in life, so I don't really care about what she has to say to me from beyond the grave. Like, why didn't somebody more interesting, and she mentioned Elizabeth Cady. Why didn't Elizabeth Cady come through? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was also one of the great, women in the women's suffrage movement. So, her brush with the spiritual side of modern spiritualism didn't meet with her approval because she didn't like her great aunt. But anyway, Susan B. Anthony was a great admirer of Marion Skidmore. They were friends. And Marion Skidmore's sense of purpose and her passion for the development of Lilydale, her very equitable relationship and true love marriage with her husband, which again was not always typical of the Victorian era. A lot of that impacted the molding of Martha Quinn's character. You guys will remember Martha Sloan was one of the original characters from the Orphans and Inmates series. We see her grow up to become a physician in the Seer and the Scholar, and she becomes more active in modern spiritualism. I can't tell you why, because I'd be giving things away if you haven't read the books. But a lot of her character in the later books is really influenced by Marion Skidmore. And I said, in particular, her very equitable relationship with her husband, her very powerful impact on the community of Lilydale, and, you know, just her overall attitude of passion and don't mess with me and all of those sorts of things. So you'll hopefully, if you read or reread those books, you'll see a little bit of Marion Skidmore in the character of Martha. Elizabeth Lowe Watson was another woman who had a huge impact on the suffrage movement, but also on the beginnings of modern spiritualism in general. She grew up in neighboring Cattaraugus County. As a young woman, she was one of the speakers. As I said, Elizabeth Lowe, before she was married, was one of the speakers who went to Leona to speak among the free thinkers. She had only a common school education, but she was very educated on topics like slavery and temperance and women's rights, and she was very outspoken. And so she, again, I think her attachment to spiritualism had to do with the loss of her children as well. Not all of those 9 children were biologically hers. Some of them were her, you know, were children from another marriage. But anyway, the loss of them were profound, and the ability to be able to speak to people on the other side comforted her, you know, in dealing with those losses. And she moved out of New York actually before the founding of the Cassadaga Free Lake Society. She moved to California, where she was a pastor in San Francisco at a spiritualist church. Her home of Sunny Brae in California became a mecca for free thinkers. Susan B. Anthony was also a guest of Elizabeth Lowe Watson, and she appears in The Girl on the Shore, which is one of the later books in my series, as herself, because she does the dedication speech at the Cassadaga Lake Free Association in 1880. That camp session in 1880 marked the transition from the Religious Society of Free Thinkers into the more established, almost year-round residents of the Cassadaga Lake Free Society. And there was a big dedication as part of the camp session, and there were a couple of speakers who were supposed to be part of that process. And one of them didn't show up, so Elizabeth Lowe Watson ended up speaking for much longer than she was supposed to an absolutely riveted crowd. And so she is credited to be one of the, you know, foundation people of the Cassadaga Lake Free Society, in addition to really being instrumental in gaining for women the right to vote in California. And so she's a character that has a more substantial impact on history than she does on my books, but she was an interesting person to place in Lilydale and Cassadaga at that time. And so I felt like it was important to present her as herself rather than as another character. So some of these characters that are like the Fox sisters show up in my book as themselves. Marion Skidmore doesn't. She really more was credited to molding one of my characters. And Elizabeth Lowe Watson, because of her impact on the association, I wanted to portray her historical speech as it was. So she sort of shows up as herself. And we only see her for a very glimpse in The Girl on the Shore. But another person who was a very, very interesting historical figure was Antoinette Matheson, and she influenced the character of Alva Ewald, who you start to see in A Lifetime again, but her character is really interesting, and we see her throughout the rest of the series. Antoinette Matheson was absolutely fascinating. The more I learned about her, the more I wanted to know more. Again, because she was so different from normal Victorian women. She came to Western New York from Germany in the 1850s, and she already had sort of this ability to put herself in a trance and to be able to contact people in the spirit world. And she developed those abilities more as an adult in the Western New York area, and she was able to really train herself to be a clairvoyant healer. And so what that means is that she was able to put herself in contact with her spirit guide through this trance. And her spirit guide was Native American. And this Native American woman then was able to give Ms. Matheson all of these botanical treatments for various ailments. And she was a big believer in botanical treatments at a time when modern medicine was just getting underway. You know, we start to see medical schools showing up in the Buffalo area in the 1840s and 50s. So by 1880, 1890s, you know, modern medicine is very much, as it was then, very male dominated. They were trying to, you know, sort of distance themselves from the sort of, you know, women as healers using botanical and old world methods. There was very much a separation from that kind of healing. And so here comes Antoinette Matheson into Buffalo, and she was actually a resident of the city of Buffalo. She had a house on Division Street, and her husband passed away, I think, in the 1860s, 1870s. And so she needed to make a living on her own. And she was a very, very well-respected healer. That was the thing that was sort of the thorn in the side of the medical community in Buffalo, is that she had a very expansive clientele. She had a lot of important people in the city of Buffalo that she had as clients. And so she was kind of a nuisance to the Buffalo Medical Society. And they often had her arrested, excuse me, for practicing medicine without a license. And she, you know, the money that she made through this business, she invested very prudently in real estate. And so her real estate transactions, you can track through the newspapers, as well as all of the attempts to arrest her. Her story is fascinating. And she really was sort of a thorn in the side of the Medical Association in Buffalo. And at the same time, her oldest daughter, Martha Call, actually attends the University of Buffalo as a physician. And so she also sort of, you know, takes the side of the practicing physicians in Buffalo, and she's had her mother arrested a few times for practicing medicine without a license. And so she has a very adversarial relationship with this older daughter. But her younger daughter, Nellie, actually she grooms to sort of become her protege. And Nellie also has these clairvoyant abilities and is able to do some of the spiritual healing that her mother does. And so it's interesting to me that while so many in Buffalo thought her a quack, many more thought her legitimate and sought her out as a legitimate healer, particularly when they were unable to get relief through the sort of standard medicine at the time. So her daughter Nellie also was a clairvoyant healer, and her son took over the sort of manufacturing and selling of all of these botanical cures. So she had quite a lucrative business that involved her younger two children. She had a very adversarial relationship with the older daughter. And so toward the end of her life, in the early years of the turn of the 20th century, as she sort of stopped practicing medicine and Nellie really took on the practice, the older daughter became convinced that Nellie was squandering the vast fortune that her mother had amassed. And of course, you know, Martha was very concerned about wanting to have her fair share when her mother died. It was really all about the inheritance. And so she tried to have her mother declared insane. And which probably would have been a fairly easy thing to do, considering, as I said, the fact that she was such a nuisance to the medical community. But they had to actually try to find her to serve her with papers to be, you know, deposed as a witness in her own trial. And they couldn't find her to serve papers. And it was interesting because she did have a home in Lilydale, and she probably hid out there a little while they were trying to serve her with papers to stand trial. The trial did go on without her, and one of her own, he was a cousin, was a doctor, and also a lawyer, another family member there were all kinds of family members who were testifying against her. But eventually the case was dropped because they could never actually find her and interview her and have it determined by a court of law whether she was insane or not. And the way the law works in New York is if you challenge, you know, the diagnosis of insanity, you can do it in a court of law, but she had to have been interviewed by physicians in order for that to happen. And the newspaper, I don't know whether they were serious or not, but they attributed her ability to be able to sort of avoid being served with the idea that she was a clairvoyant. So she always knew when they were coming and she could always run and hide. So eventually the case was dropped and she, she died, and she, her inheritance was divided between the three children. And so I became really interested in the idea of her inheritance. So I petitioned her will actually from county court. And it was a huge document because of all of her real estate transactions. And so there was a lot of stuff to deal with in her will. But of her sort of fluid cash, it was divided among her three children, but she had loaned her son and her daughter, older daughter, Martha, sums of money, which they had not paid back at the time of her death. And she actually deducted it from their inheritance. So she was like, not even in death was she going to let her daughter get the better of her. And so her character, just the idea that she was this nuisance in the medical community, but was actually having success in treating illnesses that modern physicians at the time were unable to treat. And the fact that she was so strong-willed and basically a real estate tycoon, in the Victorian age, all of this made me, I wanted a character, I wanted to mold a character after her, but I didn't want it to be her because I wanted this other character to have the latitude to do and other things that she didn't do. And it's very dicey when you deal with historical people in historical fiction, because you really shouldn't stray from the historic record. And she was enough of a public figure that I just didn't want to do that. So the character of Alva, who makes her first appearance in A Lifetime Again, really was modeled after Antoinette Matheson. And Alva's part of her character's mission was to make sure that people who were recognized as having extrasensory or intersensory abilities were treated fairly and not ending up in places like insane asylums. And ultimately, she teams up with Martha Quinn, and together they are this sort of unstoppable duo in the medical community. And I just, I envision them causing all kinds of trouble, these two Victorian women who were supposed to behave themselves and didn't. And so she really is a character that persists through the story. Even though Antoinette Matheson, I believe she died in 1913, she was remembered, long after that, decades after that, for her benevolent, acts of charity in the city. She had soup kitchens, in the city of Buffalo for people who couldn't afford to eat. She was for as stingy as she was with her own children, and as adversarial as she was with her own children, and as much of a nuisance she was publicly, she had another side to her that was very benevolent and charitable. And that was, as I said, remembered decades after her death. So she was another of these strong-willed women who I really wanted to remember and honor in these books. And so hopefully when you read the books and you read about Alva's character, you'll see a little bit of Antoinette Matheson in there. This is her house in Lilydale. It's obviously, she's not living in it now. But, to me, that connection that she's still there was really important. It took a while to track her down, because the way the property works in Lilydale is you don't own the property, you own the house. Even to this day, you own the house, you lease the property. And the reason for that is that Lilydale always wanted to retain its integrity as a religious community. And so even in order to reside in Lilydale and own a house, you still have to be a member of a spiritualist church. Like, they didn't want it to come in and turn into a vacation resort, and they didn't want the lakeside property exploited by developers. And so even to this day, Lilydale maintains that original idea that you don't own property. The property is owned by the assembly and it's leased, and much of the homes they end up being inherited, because it's very tricky to sell them. You have to have a cash buyer, because most banks won't give you a loan to buy just a house and no property, because you don't own the property. So it's very tricky. So if you've not been to Lilydale, I highly recommend that you go, because it's a fascinating place. but it's an interesting mixture of sort of these dilapidated houses and these just beautiful Victorian masterpieces. And the reason for that is it's very difficult to, again, to sell property. So a lot of times people inherit these little cottages, and it's very, very expensive to try to do anything with them because everything has to be brought in to the community, and it's very, very difficult to sell them. So it's an interesting mix of this sort of dilapidated houses that are run down and these beautiful Victorian perfect places like this home. And so I did find her in the records as one of the original house owners of this particular cottage. And it just the whole idea of Lilydale now, I really think it's fascinating because as the century turned from 19th to 20th, and this idea of spiritualism took hold, particularly among wealthy people, there was a ton of fraud. I mean, a ton of fraud. And, Harry Houdini was one of the sort of notorious people who came to Lilydale to expose fraud. And there certainly was a lot of it at that time to expose. And in the recent modern community, Lilydale has gone to great lengths to dispel that image. They have a very strict, they have a board of directors with a very strict code of conduct of the types of mediumship that can be done on the property and the types of mediumship that can't. So the sorts of seances and table moving and things that can be easily faked are not allowed on the premise. Only registered mediums who pass a very strict test by the board are allowed to practice on the, within the boundaries of the community. And it's a very, very interesting place to be because for me, again, anthropology clouds my every vision, but what's interesting to me is as a religion here, they are not out to recruit you. They don't even care whether you believe in them or not. They are there to do their thing. People who live there year round or during the season are there to partake in the religious and spiritual elements of living in Lilydale, which is thought to be, the ground itself is thought to be very sacred. And they don't care whether, they're happy to share it with you, don't get me wrong, but they're not out to convert you at all. And people are very happy to answer your questions. There are plenty of opportunities once you pay the gate fee of having readings at no charge and having healing sessions at no charge. People that want to partake in an actual reading can schedule and pay for one as well. So I really felt like it was an interesting place. And again, not like most religions, because they're not trying to sign you up. They're there doing their thing. They're happy to share it with you. They're happy if you become interested. If you leave disgruntled, that's a shame, but it's not anything they're going to lose sleep over. That's sort of my impression of this. And so I think for people who are skeptical, it's a really good place to go because you get your questions answered by people who aren't trying to convert you. And so for me, that was very interesting. And people always end up asking me, are you a spiritualist? Not really. I'm interested in it. I'm on the fence as to whether or not all that spiritualism claims is valid. I still don't know. I'm open to it, but I'm skeptical of it. I don't have any special abilities that I'm aware of. But the fact that the place of this religion in history, particularly of Buffalo's history, just fascinates me. The place, and then the things that happened around it, particularly the women's suffrage movement, which got way more support here than it did, for example, at the Chautauqua Institute. I mean, all of that just fascinates me. So I continue to do research into the history of Lilydale. It continues to be part of my stories simply because it's fascinating to me. But for the first time this year, I'm actually going to go down and participate in some of their workshops and in some of their classes and see if I can learn, because the other claim of spiritualism, which is interesting, is that all of us have these abilities. All of us have the ability to connect with spirit, to make contact with the other side. And I've never, ever tried to learn how to do that. So I'm going to try to do that this summer, hopefully. And that might make for some interesting talks in University Express next season. I don't know. But anyway, there's almost too many books to put on a slide these days. The series, if you're unfamiliar with it, starts with the book Orphans and Inmates and starts in Buffalo's history in 1835-36. And it moves through the latest book, In the Shadow of the White Oak, which actually takes you from colonial times through the 19th century and into the 1920s. And so we're sort of gaining, interest and insight into Buffalo's history. We add other elements of the world that were going on, from things like infectious diseases to the experience of Native Americans as Buffalo transitions from this tiny little village into this big industrial city. We start to see things that happened in the city during the 1920s and the impact of the institutions, which are still very much up and running. The poorhouse didn't cease to exist until 1926. The Buffalo State Asylum didn't cease to exist until, really it still exists as the Buffalo Psych Center, but really as the institution in 1974. So these institutions really continue to have an impact on Buffalo's history into the modern world. And I was telling Katie earlier that one of the things that seemed glaringly absent from my research that became evident to me last summer during all of the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on in Buffalo was the African-American impact on Buffalo and its history. And so that's something I wanted to try to research for the next book in the series. As I mentioned to her earlier, that's been sort of come to a screeching halt because I've had some health issues that have really severely limited my ability to do research, but I'm hoping by spring of next year to have that book out. So hopefully have something new for you in 2022. And so I feel like because I have no feedback, that I'm just talking to a blank screen in I don't want to talk anymore. So I'm really happy to answer anybody else's questions. It's weird not to be able to see the reactions of people. I hope nobody fell asleep.
Well, I can't say nobody fell asleep, but I will say that was amazing. And we have questions and comments here, Roseanne. So we'll get started on those. Thank you for walking us through that talk.
Okay, can you tell them to me? Because I don't know that I can read them.
Yep, I was planning on reading them to you.
Perfect.
So we had one comment that came through when you were talking about the Fox sisters at the end of that slide. And this person says, cancel culture, ?
I'm not sure I would have to ask what that person means by cancel culture.
Fair enough. We'll see if they want to put that in there. This next comment is, have so enjoyed your chronological books and appreciate your research revealing the untold rich history of Western New York. Fascinating and important as we realize how filtered, gender, and race biased it was.
Thank you. And it's true. So much of history is told through a single lens. And I think we didn't really start to really give that a whole lot of thought until maybe the last couple of decades. And I think now people are really starting to, and maybe to get back to an issue of cancel culture. And I'm not sure I'm putting this in the correct context because I'm not sure what that person meant, but inquiry of any kind, of scientific or historical, is a constant. And we make inquiries into history as we make scientific, as we do scientific experiments, and we make conclusions based on the evidence we have at the time, or based on the evidence that was presented to us. But there's always in any scholar's mind the idea that somebody is going to have a different point of view, or somebody is going to have information that you don't, that's going to change the outcome of what is accepted as sort of the general conclusions of the time. And so we're only now realizing that yes, history is very gender biased, absolutely. And Buffalo's history included lots of people besides white people. Native Americans were here before we were. Buffalo was a part of the Underground Railroads. African Americans had a significant impact on Buffalo's history. And so I part of the reason, these books are fiction, make no mistake, they're stories, but I like to try to at least pique the interest of people by starting to talk about some of the other groups of people that made an impact on the city and its history. And that That's not an attempt to cancel anything. Because that's really not what we do. When you find new information, it adds to the current understanding. That's all it does. It doesn't cancel anything. And I think that word has become, it's like defund the police. It's come to mean something that it never was supposed to mean to begin with. So to me, finding out new things doesn't make the things we already knew less important. It just adds to the picture. And it's fun to be able to do that for me.
All right, thanks, Roseanne. This next one is, did I miss it? Where did the name Lilydale come from?
So there's lots of different possibilities of where Lilydale came from. And I'm a little fuzzy on this, so I may not be speaking correctly, but there was an area around Cassadaga Lake where a lot of lilies grew, and part of the picnics took place there. And they referred to that section as Lilydale. Also, when the whole controversy with Alden's family, when they used to have the picnics at Alden's Grove, and then once he died, the family didn't want to do it without compensation. And so the free thinkers sort of moved and purchased that area around Cassadaga Lake, but the Alden family still saw that these camp sessions were lucrative, and they still had them, and they referred to them as Lilydale. So for me, the historical research of the transition in name, I'm not like the modern day part of Lilydale. I haven't started researching yet into the 20th century. I believe the name change was in 1906. And I don't really know because my research is still back in the Cassadaga Lake days. So I'm not really sure of the actual reasons why they changed the name, only because my research has focused on the area previous. But that's one of the things that I'm actually gonna, because my books are starting to emerge into the 20th century. So too will the Lilydale parts of them, and that research will come out in other books. And so hopefully I'll have a less befuddled answer to that question at a later time.
Thanks, Roseanne. This next one, how did folks arrive at Lilydale in the mid-1800s?
There was a train station. I mean, in the early years, prior to, I can't remember when it was early on in the late 1880s, maybe there was a train that went directly there. But before then there was a stagecoach, and there was just, they called it the Buffalo Road. And so people came in wagons. It depended on who, but in the big, heyday of the Cassadaga Lake Free Society, there was a train stop that came right there, and they came by train.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing that. We have a comment. Very interesting presentation. I will look for these books to read up on some more.
Thank you.
We have, do you know if there is a connection between Lilydale and the spiritual community in Florida that's north of Orlando?
They are also Cassadaga, I believe. And there is a woman, oh gosh, her name is going to escape me. Marilyn, oh gosh, I can't remember her name, who kind of resides at both. And I think all of the spiritualist communities are connected in a way. Spiritualists spend the summer going around, like Chesterfield is in Illinois, and I know that there's back and forth. Lilydale, to my knowledge, is the biggest spiritualist community in the country. And when I have been there in the summer for the brief times I'm there, there's always residents of other spiritualist communities who come even for a short period of time. I know friends of mine from Lilydale go to Chesterfield and go to Florida as well, and in other areas. So I think there's a lot of communication between the spiritualist camps around the country.
Okay, thanks, Roseanne.
Sure.
No, we're coming up on time here, but we have quite a few more things. Is that okay with you?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, awesome. This next one is, were there psychics of color at Lilydale in the 1800s, 1900s, and now?
That is a fascinating question that I have been trying to find out. And the short answer to that question is no, there were not in the 19th century. The nearest thing I could find with the help of one of the historians at Lilydale was the mention of a man of color who spent time in Lilydale, but I think I want to say he was a shoemaker, but I could be wrong. his death was it was a death announcement, but like we've looked at all the pictures and we've looked at all the like the chronicle of, you know, newspaper. Most of Lilydale's history is chronicled through newspaper accounts, and there didn't appear to be any mediums of color that came in and out of Lilydale at that time period, which makes my the part of my books that deal with Charlotte Lambert a little tricky. So I'm because of that. Because she is of color and is a descendant anyway. But anyway, there were mediums of color in Chicago. There are mediums of color now, certainly, but not at the time period, not that we've been able to find out so far.
Okay, thanks, Roseanne.
Sure.
Next, we have, what do homes cost in Lilydale?
That's a good question, and I haven't had the courage to look. I mean, you know, one of my dream retirement, I have two dream retirements. One is this remote island on the west coast of Ireland, and the other is Lilydale. So I mean, I don't know that. I think they are quite expensive, and I think I have heard that it's difficult to get a mortgage because of the idea that there's no land associated with the house. So that's an excellent question. I don't know. I'm afraid to ask. I don't want my dream to be ripped out from underneath me.
I can understand that. All right.
I mean, I imagine it's like anything else. You find the right house that needs a lot of work and you talk to the, I mean, you know, I imagine it's like anything else. You can find a deal if you're looking for one and you're willing to negotiate, but I don't quote me on that because I'm afraid to look.
All right, we won't quote you. Next thing here, any sense if immigrants from Eastern Europe were attracted to or accepted by the community at Lilydale?
That's like a Mary McNamara question. She's the woman she's done a lot of historical research on Lilydale, and I think, you know, there were a lot of immigrants that came to Buffalo as a general rule. The Eastern Europe, not until later, as far as I'm aware, like later into the 20th century, the early decades. Well, Lilydale welcomed everybody, so they wouldn't not welcome anybody. And so I don't, again, not really knowing a lot about the later years yet. I don't know that I can answer that question intelligently, but as a community, they welcomed everybody. So I can't imagine there would be any group of people, because spiritualists in general are very accepting of all everything, of all genders, of all religions, of all ethnicities. So I can't imagine there'd be anybody that wouldn't. And, you know, not having researched specific mediums historically other than Antoinette Matheson and Marion Skidmore, you know, I don't really know about the ethnic background or cultural background of most of the people there.
Okay, thank you, Roseanne. Just have a couple more things here and then we can wrap up. We have, again, another great presentation. You truly bring out how our communities are intertwined. We need to learn from our past, both triumphs and failures, bringing them out in your books and talks in a way we can remember our history and share it with others.
Thank you. You know, just if there's a couple different sources. If you have questions that I'm unable to answer, and I am by no means an expert, please understand that. Ron Nagy is the historian at Lilydale. There is a Lilydale Facebook page, and I think he can be at least reached through there. There's another, Mary McNamara is also a resident of Lilydale, who does a lot of historical research, and she's been a huge resource for me, as well as Ron. So they're both available on Facebook. Again, if you just even look for the Lilydale Facebook page, not only does it give you information on the history, but it gives you information on the kinds of things that they do during the camp season. And again, I mean, it's just worth a trip. If you're a gardener, go. Their gardens are fantastic. You know, there's a little beach there, you know, so there's lots to do. Even if you're not interested in seeing, I've never had an official reading when I was there. I've been sort of picked out of the crowd a couple times at the group sessions. But I mostly sit in the library when I'm there. But, you know, there's shopping and there's the beach and there's restaurants, and Fredonia's close by, so there's places to eat there too. It's really an interesting place to go. Just out of idle curiosity. And like I said, even for people who are skeptical, I really feel like you know, you get your questions answered honestly by people who have no vested interest in making you believe anything over anything else.
Thank you, Roseanne. Thank you for that information. Let's see, we have, is there a particular book of yours that discusses Lilydale?
I think probably A Lifetime Again and The Girl on the Shore have the most to do with Lilydale. You know, there'll be more, I think, probably in the book I'm writing, but it's always there in the background somewhere because of the link of the characters and the idea that the most recent book, In the Shadow of the White Oak, deals more with the people with sort of spiritualist healing abilities in Buffalo. Some of the characters who are now, you know, descendants of the Sloan, you know, Martha Sloan in particular, and have her abilities, and the sort of that ongoing controversy between that sort of traditional kind of healing and modern medicine that deals a lot with that. So not necessarily Lilydale, the community, but some of the ideas of spiritualism and of particularly of healing.
Cool. Okay, two more things here, and then we can.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, good. We have, thank you for the history of Lilydale. It's not appropriate to compare the politics of today. We're learning of things of the past. Hopefully you will be able to continue more info as the community progressed.
Hopefully.
And then we have, thanks, excellent talk.
Thank you.
And then somebody's wondering why kicked out, but I think you said picked out. So why picked out at the group sessions? If you could just speak to what that looks like, maybe.
Oh, you mean like the camp sessions?
Yes, you mentioned that you haven't attended an actual formal session, but at the group
Oh,
session,
picked out. No, yeah. So, okay. So what happens there? You pay a gate fee to get into Lilydale. I don't know what it is now. It used to be like $12, but I don't know what it is anymore. And once you go in, there are several opportunities for you to experience what they do at no additional cost. So there's the Healing Temple where you can participate in healing. Energy healing. There are numerous places where you can be part of a like a group where a bunch of psychic mediums will come and they will choose is a better word, people out of the group and give you a reading. It's sort of a random thing. And I have been chosen out of the group before. It was really an interesting thing. In fact, my husband's really mad at me because we were both going, and I was doing a book signing at the bookstore, and I wanted to make sure I went to the group reading it. They called it Inspiration Stump. It's in the Leolin Woods. And so he said, I said, well, go save me a seat and I'll come as soon as I'm done. So they had just gotten started, and he was like the second row from the front. And I came in, and he kind of moved over, and I sat in that seat like closest. And the guy picked me out right away. And my husband was so mad because if he hadn't moved over, he might have picked Bob. But it was really interesting because it was a reading that included my husband's father, which we wanted to know, we wanted to hear from anyway. So it was kind of was for both of us. But he told me that I stole his psychic thunder. But there are several opportunities throughout the day to participate in those group events. And all there, I mean, most of the people who reside there are practicing mediums. And if you want to schedule a reading, the best advice is to call ahead and schedule it before you get there. But there are other people that have walk-in appointments as well. So if you want to have a formal one-on-one reading, there are tons of opportunities to do that. Those are at additional charges. But there are opportunities to experience what modern spiritualists do at no additional charge beyond the gate fee.
Awesome. Thanks, Roseanne.
Sure.
We have somebody that's saying, before anyone who's on the fence about Lilydale go first to the Spiritualist Temple in East Aurora. Many times the lecture is from Lilydale.
Oh, sure.
Well, that's interesting to know. Thank you for that. All right.
Yeah, from what I understand, there are a couple of modern spiritualist churches in the area. I don't know of any. I mean, I might check out that church as well, because that's the other part of the research that I'd like to do, is see what what the relationship is now with the city of Buffalo and the community. And I haven't really done that because I've been stuck in the past. So I'd be interested to do the, just a quick aside about the research that I do. There's always that, because I am a scholar, there's always that temptation to be pulled down a rabbit hole that I have to resist. So Lilydale is a very good example of that. Because I balance the writing with, all the responsibilities I have elsewhere in my life, I can't get sucked down those rabbit holes. So I have to really compartmentalize the research to the period I'm dealing with, and only, learn as much as I need to know for the book that I'm writing. So by no means, other than the poorhouse research, which is comprehensive because that's my scholarly research, most of the rest of this is, by my feeling, very superficial. And I never know as much as I want to know because I don't have an unlimited amount of time to, research all of these things. So it's always a very delicate juggling act to know what to try to be informed, but, not get so bogged down in that research that I forget that I'm actually writing a book.
That has to be a really interesting dance.
Yeah, it is. It's very frustrating. I don't like the responsibilities of being a modern grown-up. I just want to be in the library.
Well, you're an amazing writer, Roseanne, and we appreciate everything you do and educating us on all of this stuff. And to everyone who's on, thank you for your time today. This was great.
Thank you very much. It's always a privilege. I love the University Express. I can't wait to see everybody in person in the fall. Hopefully I'll have more adventures of Lilydale to share.
Oh, yes, looking forward to that. All right, bye, everyone.
Thank you.